bottomless well. A chilling breeze whispered through the cracked window pane of my new apartment, a sound that seemed to carry secrets from the old building's long history. I had just moved to a small, forgotten town nestled deep in a valley, a place the modern world seemed to have overlooked. My apartment was on the top floor of a converted Victorian manor, a grandiose but decaying structure that loomed over the town like a skeletal guardian. The rent was suspiciously cheap, a detail I had conveniently ignored in my desperation to escape the relentless noise of the city. My landlord, a gaunt, weary-eyed man named Mr. Alastair, had given me a hurried tour, his words clipped and his gaze constantly darting towards the shadows that clung to the corners of every room. He had a peculiar habit of tapping his fingers against every wall we passed, a rhythmic, almost ritualistic gesture that I found unsettling. When I asked about the previous tenant, his face tightened and he muttered something about them leaving in a hurry, no forwarding address. The first few nights were uneventful, filled with the usual sounds of an old building settling. Creaks, groans, the distant rumble of pipes. I dismissed them as the house's natural symphony. But then, other sounds began to weave their way into the nightly chorus, a soft, rhythmic tapping. It started faintly, almost imperceptibly, like a leaky faucet in a distant room. At first I assumed it was a neighbor. I'd press my ear to the wall, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once, a disembodied beat within the very bones of the building. The tapping would always start just after midnight, a slow, deliberate cadence. Tap, tap, tap. It was patient, methodical, and it scraped against my nerves like a dull blade. I tried to reason with myself. It was probably the plumbing, or a tree branch against the siding, or my own overactive imagination running wild in a new, spooky environment. One evening, I finally worked up the courage to ask Mr. Alastair about the noise. I found him in the dimly lit foyer, meticulously polishing an old brass doorknob. When I described the tapping, his hand froze mid-polish. His face, usually a mask of weary indifference, paled several shades. He avoided my eyes, his gaze fixed on the doorknob as if it held some profound answer. "It's just the old house," he said, his voice a low, strained whisper. "Pipes expand and contract. The wood settles. You'll get used to it." His explanation was too quick, too rehearsed. He practically fled back into his ground-floor apartment, leaving me standing alone in the echoing foyer, the scent of brass polish and something else. Something like damp earth hanging in the air. His reaction didn't soothe my fears. It amplified them. He knew what the sound was, and he was terrified of it. That night, the tapping was louder, more insistent. Tap, tap, tap. It was no longer just in the walls, it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from inside my own apartment. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. The sound seemed to be emanating from the large, built-in wardrobe that stood against the far wall of my bedroom. It was an imposing piece of dark, carved wood, original to the house, and its doors had been painted shut long ago. Mr. Alastair had warned me not to try and open it, claiming it was structurally unsound and sealed for a reason. Driven by a mix of terror and a desperate need for answers, I crept out of bed and approached the wardrobe. As I got closer, the tapping stopped. Silence descended upon the room, a silence so profound it felt heavier and more threatening than the noise it had replaced. I pressed my ear against the cold, painted wood. Nothing. Just the frantic thumping of my own pulse. The next day, fueled by a sleepless night and a growing obsession, I decided to investigate the history of the manor. The small-town library was a dusty sanctuary of forgotten lore. The librarian, a woman with kind eyes and a wealth of local knowledge, helped me navigate the archives. As I sifted through brittle newspapers and faded photographs, a story began to emerge. Decades ago, the manor had belonged to a wealthy, eccentric family. The patriarch, a man named Silas Croft, had a daughter named Alara. The articles described Alara as a frail, reclusive girl who suffered from a rare and debilitating illness that confined her to her room. One article, a small tragic notice from the local paper, reported her sudden death at a young age. The official cause was her illness, but whispers and rumors, hinted at in later, more sensationalist articles, suggested something far more sinister. Some townsfolk believed Silas, ashamed of his daughter's condition, had essentially imprisoned her in her room. The most chilling discovery was a floor plan of the original manor. I traced the layout with a trembling finger, my eyes widening in horror as I located my own apartment. My bedroom, the very room with the sealed wardrobe, was marked as Ilara's nursery. But there was something else on the plan, a detail that hadn't been on the modern blueprints. Behind the wall where the wardrobe now stood, there was a small shaded rectangle labeled Hidden Passage. A cold dread washed over me. A passage, a sealed-off space. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The landlord's fear, the previous tenant's hasty departure, the painted-shut wardrobe. And the tapping. A slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone patiently, desperately, trying to get out. That night I didn't wait for the sound to start. Armed with a crowbar from my toolbox and a heavy-duty flashlight, I stood before the wardrobe, my resolve hardening into a cold, sharp point. The paint cracked and splintered under the force of the crowbar. It took several minutes of violent, frantic prying, the screech of metal on wood echoing through the silent apartment. But finally, one of the doors groaned open. A wave of musty, stagnant air, thick with the smell of decay and damp soil, washed over me, making me gag. I shone my flashlight into the darkness beyond. It wasn't a wardrobe. It was a doorway, a dark, narrow opening leading into the wall. As I peered into the oppressive blackness, the tapping started again. But this time it wasn't coming from the walls around me. It was coming from the darkness right in front of me. Tap, tap, tap. It was soft, weak, but undeniably close. My breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the door, run, and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know. I took a hesitant step through the opening, the flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. I was in a narrow, claustrophobic corridor, barely wide enough for my shoulders. The walls were rough, unfinished brick, slick with a damp, unpleasant film. The air was cold, heavy, and carried the cloying scent of rot. I followed the passage as it sloped gently downwards, the tapping growing ever so slightly louder with each step. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of a small, delicate finger, methodically tapping against wood. The passage ended abruptly at a solid brick wall. There was no door, no exit. It was a dead end. I swept my light across the bricks, confused. Where was the sound coming from? Then my light fell upon the floor, and I saw it. Set into the dusty, earth-covered floor was a small square wooden trapdoor, no bigger than a shoebox. It was old and warped, and the sound was coming directly from it. Tap, tap, tap. It was the sound of someone trapped beneath the floor. My blood ran cold. Was this Ilara's fate? Not just confined to her room, but sealed away in this forgotten space, left to die? Was it her spirit, her restless energy that was still here? Still tapping, still hoping someone would hear? With a trembling hand, I reached down and gripped the small iron ring on the trapdoor. It was cold to the touch. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and pulled.